look and put it into the chat as well, so that you'll have a kind of record of what we talked about today. And we are also working on getting the transcriptions of these sort of edited and published open access, so we have a record of it. So thank you. Those are our kind of etiquette questions. So thank you. As I think we've got some more people trickling in, I'll start with our kind of formal intro for everyone. So I am Professor Anna Feigenbaum, and I am from the Center for Science, Health, and Data Communication Research, which is co-hosting this event with Professor Mehita Iqani, who is the South African Research Chair in Science Communication at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And this is sort of Mehita's brainchild that we have co-developed now together. And we're really interested, we both, are in these positions with working at research centers that are interested in science communication, but we're both really interested not just in the practical side of that, but in some of the epistemological questions that lie behind what we even count, as science, and how we count in science, and how we communicate about science and related disciplines. And we liked the idea of focusing this on evidence. So what counts as evidence? Who gets to count that evidence? How does that evidence work? And power, which of course cross-cuts all of these questions about who gets to count and what counts. And so this is designed to have some deep interdisciplinary discussions around data, methodology, and authority as they cut across, policy and practice in a vast range of disciplines. And this is our second in the series. And the idea is we ask the same kind of 3 questions about these topics to our speakers each time, and we ask the speakers to bring their perspectives from those disciplinary positions into engagement with the questions with each other and with all of you. So I will turn over to Mehita, who will introduce our speakers and anything else you want to say about your center, Mehita, and you can kind of get a sense of the interdisciplinarity that we are after here.
Thanks so much, Anna. What a great introduction. And we're very delighted to have all of our participants here. And I think your introduction was perfect. What we're looking to do here is to explore different conceptual, theoretical, epistemological perspectives on what science communication means in relation to evidence, to the data that we collect and how we collect it, and to systems of power, authority, and resistance. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to our 4 wonderful speakers that we have assembled today. These are experts at different career levels and from very different disciplines, who are joining us today to speak about questions of evidence and power from the perspective of their own research, their own empirical and theoretical work. So I'm going to introduce the 4 speakers all together, and then they're going to each speak kind of in the same order in each of our rounds. And Anna and I will be co-chairing, so we'll be swapping back and forth on managing the conversation. So first up in our list is Professor Melanie Klinkner, who is an international law scholar at Bournemouth University, where she teaches public international law, international criminal law, and international human rights law. In January of this year, she was awarded an ERC Consolidator grant to develop a comprehensive human rights framework for mass grave protection, investigation, and engagement. She has previously led several other research grants on this theme, looking at questions of mass grave protection, missing persons, and other human rights issues. And in the current context of some of the things that are going on politically, I can't think of a more opportune time to hear from an expert in this area. She's also the author of numerous publications, notably the Bournemouth Protocol on Mass Grave Protection and Investigation, and the monograph, The Right to Truth in International Law, which is out with Routledge. So welcome, Melanie, to our conversation. Our next speaker is Dr. Pawas Bisht, who is a senior lecturer in media communications and culture and the deputy director of the Institute for Sustainable Futures, as well as the program director for the MA in Global Media Programs at Kiel University. He's an experienced media researcher and documentary filmmaker, and has previously worked for leading institutions in the UK, including Loughborough and Leicester universities, and in India. at Jama Millia Islamia University. His research focuses on media and cultural politics in relation to environmental activism, cultural memory, and public mobilizations of documentary storytelling. Wonderful to have you with us, Pawas. Thank you for being part of our roundtable. Our third speaker is Dr. Sthabile Kolwa, who is an astrophysicist whose research interest is on high redshift galaxy evolution, the structure and origin of the circumgalactic medium in galaxies, the characterization of bias in radio continuum surveys and radio source classification. They are a lecturer in astrophysics at the physics department of the University of Johannesburg and is also a postdoctoral researcher at the IDIA in Cape Town. Thank you so much, Sthabile, for being with us today. And our fourth speaker is Professor Leslie Swartz, who is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at Stellenbosch University. He holds 2 PhDs, one in psychology from the University of Cape Town, and another in English from Stellenbosch University. He's the editor-in-chief of the open source journal, the South African Journal of Science, and the Scandinavian Journal of Disability. And he was the founding editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Disability and serves as associate editor for several international journals. He has published widely, incredibly widely, on disability and mental health, with an emphasis on how those issues play out in sub-Saharan Africa. And he holds an NRFA rating. If you're South African, you'll know how prestigious that is and what a big deal it is in the South African Academy to hold an A rating. He has ongoing interest in research capacity development and has run writing training courses in South Africa as well as elsewhere on the continent. So thank you, Leslie, for being with us today, and welcome to all 4 speakers. We are really looking forward to hearing your insights on evidence and power. So now I think back over to Anna to get us started on our first round of conversation.
There we go. Great. Can we just have a flick of the slides so we can see it on the screen as well? Great. So our first round, we are going to ask each speaker to talk to the question, in your discipline or research area, what counts as compelling evidence?
Okay, that means I'm up, I think. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mehita, for far too kind an introduction. And thank you also to Fumani for getting the tech up and running and making sure that you can actually see me. So I was going to talk about compelling evidence in 3 areas that I'm working on. The first is international criminal law, the second is forensic science, and the third is just general truth-finding processes that happen after atrocities. So I'll try and say a few words on each of this. So in international criminal law, at the International Criminal Court in particular, there are different levels of proof that are required so that evidence is compelling or considered compelling enough to meet those threshold standards. So, of course, the highest standard before the court is beyond reasonable doubt. So that's what leads to a conviction, if there is a conviction. And the onus is on the prosecution to prove this. And the evidence that is typically presented there is varied. So it can be documentary, digital as well, but also physical and witness statements, including by experts that may say a few words on a context or on a specific finding. But for the prosecutor to start an investigation, the burden of proof is significantly lower. So at the start of the proceedings, we're actually talking about a reasonable grounds to believe threshold, and then that triggers an investigation, and potentially then cases can arise of that. So that's how it works in the international criminal realm. But of course, in forensic sciences, they also operate with the retrieval of evidence that can be used in these contexts. And it's often pieced together from a variety of sources. So I wanted to just sort of say a few words about DNA, because I think DNA identifications, which is crucial in the realm of mass graves when we were covering human remains, stands out in this regard because it's got such a high threshold that needs to be met in order for an identification, a positive identification, to be made. So that's something that you're really looking at, something that we consider to be very close to 100% in order for it to be certain enough to make a positive identification. And my third area is this truth-finding processes in general, and of course South Africa has had that in the past. But I was going to pick on a different truth-finding mechanism. The El Salvadoran Commission is one that I find quite interesting, because the mandate of these commissions and these truth-finding processes also stipulate what they can consider as fact and what they consider to be sufficient evidence for it to be part of their official records. So they need a number of sources in order for it to qualify, for example, for a proof or for evidence. And then they also have three categorizations. They speak about overwhelming evidence, so it's conclusive or highly convincing evidence to support the commission's finding. And the second level is substantial evidence, so it's very solid evidence to support the commission's finding. And then finally, there's what they call sufficient evidence, and that would mean that, you know, there's some evidence to support the commission's finding, and there's more to support it than to contradict it. So the balance of probability is in favor of inclusion rather than exclusion of this evidence. So this shows the practical ways in which evidence and categorizing evidence can happen to sort of signify how compelling it is. And I think those are the three things that I wanted to say. And I hope I kept to time.
Yes, great. I was trying to tweet you at the same time as you were wrapping up. So, so thank you very much. I think there's going to be a lot to compare there as we layer on some more definitions of evidence. So we'll now turn to our second speaker, which I think is. Do I have Sthabile on mine, but is that the same as the order that you have?
It's not the same as the slideshow, but I think we can proceed with Sthabile second as per our plans. So Sthabile, if you're ready.
All right. Yes, I am ready. Thank you very much, Mehita. Thank you, Fumani, and all the organizers for setting up this event for the second time round this year. I'm very happy to participate in it and to come here and represent the astrophysics community on this subject. So within our field, say generally within physics and astrophysics, what we consider and what counts as compelling evidence are the empirical results based on observations obtained from telescopes, such as, for instance, the Meerkat radio telescope or the James Webb Space Telescope. What we are able to do as astrophysicists and those who use observations is take this data that the telescopes are able to accumulate, process it, and with that, apply the physical principles that we know based on all the discoveries that have taken place over hundreds of years within the domain of dynamics, the dynamics of stars and galaxies, electromagnetism, electrodynamics. And we use that to try to understand the basis for the observations that we obtain physically. So that is what we consider evidence, what the physics taking place within galaxies and stars and various objects that we observe in the universe through our telescopes, what that is telling us. So that would be empirical, based on evidence. Theoretically derived results. So for those that don't use actual observations, but rather come up with a theory based on the foundation of the physics that we already have and essentially build up on that by forming new relations. They may be empirically based, or they may be based on some logical steps, equations essentially that allow us to model our physical world, in this case, astrophysical phenomena. And these models and frameworks for our observations are considered compelling evidence. essentially. So what I'm describing here is the application of the scientific method, which requires us to come up with a hypothesis of how we understand our physical reality, in this case, the reality of astrophysical phenomena, and then set up some form of an experiment, and then test our hypothesis with that experiment and draw out a set of results. And from those results, we're able to glean evidence of how an object in space, in the universe, works, how it comes to be the way we observe it through our telescopes, etc. So I described two forms of evidence, that which is based on observations and that which is based on logical mathematical steps or theory. And these two are generally intertwined. So the observations and theory are constantly interlinked in that they support each other. Without the theory, we wouldn't be able to fully understand our observations, and also without any observations to test our theory against, we also wouldn't be able to make sense of what we see. So these are the two forms of evidence that are considered compelling. And the way they become compelling and the way they come into acceptance within the broader community is through peer review, of course. So without any, let's say, mutual support from one's peers, one's scientific peers, who'd be able to validate how compelling or how valid the evidence a scientist or group of scientists is presenting, we would not be able to consider that evidence as worthy of our appreciation or acceptance into our body of knowledge of how the universe works. So that is essentially how evidence is formed within the domain of astrophysics. And a similar practice, of course, occurs in physics as well. And I wonder if I'm on time or over time, if I need to elaborate further.
Oh, you're all good. And yeah,
okay, I would prefer to end it there. Thank you.
Great. So another perspective. We're layering it up. So I've got next. Yes, go for it, Pawas.
Hi. Thank you so much, Anna, Mehita, and again, the organizing team for providing me with this fantastic platform and for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. As Mehita said, I'm a senior lecturer in communication studies, so I'm a communication scholar, but I'm also a documentary filmmaker. Thematically, my interest has been in examining representations of environmental harm. And I've been particularly interested in questions around how marginalized communities that suffer environmental harm and activists and social movements that work with them articulate claims around harm and enter conversations around justice. I have examined these kinds of questions previously around large-scale industrial disasters. At the moment, I am a part of an international team looking at these questions around the very large-scale, very prominent, very urgent crisis of air pollution, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and we're examining this in the Indian subcontinent with a particular focus on the city of New Delhi. Some of you might be cricket fans. You might know that the Cricket World Cup is going on in India at the moment, and at the moment, the city of Delhi is in media focus, particularly because we are experiencing a catastrophic episode of poor air quality. It's the 6th consecutive day of the air being in the very severely poor category, 20 times the WHO specified limit. The project that I and my team are leading at the moment is looking at the media storytelling around this this air pollution crisis, and therefore the question, my comments around the questions today are going to be focused on this particular arena of media storytelling around environmental harm and what counts as compelling evidence in this domain. We've done a large-scale study of this, and with a particular focus on air pollution. So I have a particular stake in this because I am a media storyteller and also a documentary filmmaker. So what we find is that air pollution is a crisis in the Indian subcontinent, in the city of Delhi, all year round. The city averages PM 2.5 levels. PM 2.5 is particulate matter, which is of a lower dimension than 2.5 microns in diameter. So these are really, really fine particles that can enter your bloodstream and they're in the air. And the WHO specifies a limit of 5 microgram per meter cube as the acceptable limit for this kind of particulate pollution. In general, Delhi averages nearly 10 times this. So annually, it's a huge, huge problem. But in terms of the media storytelling, the problem only assumes a position of credibility, and it becomes a crisis in the winter month when it becomes a visible crisis. So this idea of visibility of environmental contamination as something that needs to become visible, and therefore then makes for a compelling narrative for it to enter the public discussion, is something crucial. This idea of visible evidence in relation to media storytelling. The other domain of evidence that I want to flag up in relation to media storytelling around environmental harm is data, is numerical data, particularly categorizations of levels of contamination or levels of poor air quality. So these have acquired a huge prominence as evidence in the media storytelling. And there's, in our analysis, what we found is that there's an inordinate focus on these categorizations, these numerical categorizations. And what we find is that a lot of the media coverage is actually just tracking, movements up and down these scales. What we find interesting is that what these scales do is they decontextualize the problem of environmental harm and actually normalize certain levels of environmental harm. So the media reporting only actually happens when the air moves into the very top 2 categories of contamination, which is very poor and severe. At this point, we are talking contamination levels that are 10 times, more than 10 times the WHO specified limit. So before that, all the previous categories are not entering the media consciousness at all. So this is also showing you some of the problems already of this kind of evidence forming the basis of media attention and media storytelling. So I'll leave it there, and I think I'll have a chance to pick up on some of these themes later in the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. That gives us, yes, another layer of complexity. I've so far written down visible evidence, numeric, we've got forensic, we've got instrumental, and of course, the role of peer review. So Leslie, yes, bring us around.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, it's just to echo the other speakers, thank you very much for putting this together and for everyone who's involved. And I've been listening with such fascination to the other speakers. As Mehita has mentioned, I'm a sort of jack of all trades, so I'm going to confine what I have to say to the field of disability studies. And I think that when I look at the question, what counts as compelling evidence, I was very struck that Sthabile could talk about physicists as we, and there's so much contestation about this very question itself within disability studies, because a fundamental question, I think, for disability studies is who knows what about whom, and who is allowed to know what about whom, and how much are people allowed to know about themselves. So, and there's a long kind of contested and ongoing history about this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second round. It's not a mistake that the first census in South Africa, which really tried to capture disability, which was conducted by my friend Margie Schneider about 30 years ago, she titled it "We Also Count," and that's in 2 senses from the position of people with disability, because in fact, people are often counted out or discounted, but also what she's speaking to in that is the ability of people with disabilities to count and to account. So I'm part of a number of networks, including the African Network of Evidence to Action on Disability. When we're having a big conference later this year, we've been going for quite a long time, and there would certainly be people who would say, with I think some justification, there's been lots of talk in your network over a period of longer than 10 years, but in fact there hasn't been any evidence, and there's been very little action. Because I think that the fight about what actually constitutes evidence, from outside views which tend to be very medicalized historically, which I'll talk a little bit about later, to the centering of insider views and insider accounts. What place do we give in disability studies to subjectivity, and how do we take account of it, is an ongoing and central question. I realize I'm not answering the question of what constitutes compelling evidence, but I'm just saying it's so difficult to answer. And another feature of this is the question of embodiment and embodied experience, and how do we give an account to that? How do we take it seriously? So the big movement in establishing what came to be known as the British social model of disability was based on a slogan which is now known, far beyond disability studies, which is nothing about us without us. And that is the argument that knowledge is not possible and action on knowledge is not possible without the input at all levels from people who are affected by that knowledge, controlled by that knowledge in various ways, so that these questions of, who has knowledge, who's allowed to have knowledge, what am I allowed to know, what am I allowed to know about another person? So I have age-related hearing loss, but I don't identify as a person with a disability. Am I allowed to know anything about disability? And in some senses, from an embodied point of view, I can't know. And some people would say, I don't have the right to speak. So these contestations, I think, are really central to how the field is at the moment. And I'll talk a bit more about them later, but I think I've used my 2 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Lots more to get into as we head into our second round. So I will turn over to Mehita for chairing this one.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to our speakers. So in thinking about how evidence is defined, as Anna was saying, we've already got a number of layering definitions. We've talked about legal evidence categorized as overwhelming or substantial or sufficient. We've talked about empirical results and how they're analyzed, observational empirical results, how they're analyzed in relation to theoretical, logical results. We've thought about different forms of visibility and different forms of knowledge based on embodied experience versus external policymaking. So evidence itself is contested, which is partly the super interesting question that we're wanting to explore in the seminar series. So what this leads us to is the question about what evidence is considered implementable, if you like, by those in positions of authority in the world broadly, as well as perhaps in the discipline. So our second round question is to invite our speakers to reflect on how in the experience and the insights that they've gained through the research they've done over the years, how have they seen or observed or experienced what is considered to be compelling evidence in their fields being deployed by powerful actors, either positively or negatively, or perhaps, I don't know if there are any other options outside of positive and negative. So in this round, we're wanting to think about how is evidence implemented, used, or deployed in a kind of top-down manner. So big question, I know. So who better to kick us off on thinking about that than Melanie? So over to you.
Thank you again for this question. So this got me a little bit worried because, of course, in international law, we're talking about courts and their institutions of authority and their institutions of power. So court judgments, I think, can be considered a top-down approach. And indeed, state decision, I think, probably as well as, for example, authorities such as a Truth Commission. So for me, there are some cases that stand out here. And when I spoke before, I said, actually, there are different types of evidence that at different stages in processes can be considered compelling enough to proceed. I haven't said very much about how that's tested. So I'm taking the opportunity now to delve a little bit deeper into that. So for me, the investigation of mass graves stands out here to produce actually a very reliable set of evidence. And this has come before the courts, particularly in relation to the Srebrenica genocide that you may or may not be aware of, that happened in the 1990s in Bosnia. In particular, two individuals called Mr. Karadzic and Mr. Mladic have been found guilty of genocide. And here we had investigations on the ground in Bosnia, and I think they have really proven to be legitimate and also authorized, but then still not uncontested. So in the case of mass grave investigations in Bosnia, the point was to corroborate victim and witness accounts of the actual massacres through physical evidence and determine an accurate count of who were the victims in terms of sex, cause of time of death, ethnicity. That's very, very important for genocide in this particular instance. But generally, can the identity of the victims be ascertained and the links to the perpetrators be made? And what was so striking in the Karadzic and Mladic cases is that the chambers really did say this is beyond reasonable doubt, and it met the threshold of genocide. And there's a great deal of patterns and systematicity that was shown through those investigations. And to prove genocide, the bar is incredibly high because you also have to prove the intent to want to commit genocide, and that can be inferred from the evidence. So that was really an interesting, to me, it really is a most pertinent example of how a plethora of evidence has come before a court and resulted in this top-down verdict that says this is beyond reasonable doubt. And yet, despite the fact that this forensic evidence and other evidence was tested in court, rigorously taken apart, peer-reviewed, all the things that we've heard from the other speakers, and probably also conducted in a very impartial manner, that independence and impartiality is contested. And there are voices that would reject those findings as unpersuasive or unacceptable, despite the fact that there's physical evidence to prove the contrary. And this is very difficult because it shapes narratives, it shapes politics, it shapes historical accounts. I find a little bit of solace in the fact that these forensic investigations have also another purpose. So not just to produce information and evidence for the courts, but also to actually ultimately speak to the victims and result in returns of human remains. So despite the fact that the historical accounts might be contested, the ultimate benefit to the survivors still can accrue by virtue of having their human remains returned. And so in that sense, there is that element of persuasiveness for the individuals. And that's probably a very good example of a very authoritative way of compelling evidence and how it enters the narrative. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melanie. That is very, compelling, as you put it, a compelling case study for us to think about. So let's now move from the domain of there goes my timer. You were so well on time that, so we're moving now from the what lies beneath the soil, tragically and devastatingly, now into the universe above. So I think our next speaker, if we follow the same pattern as the first round, would be Sthabile. Are you there and are you ready to take this conversation further, Sthabile?
Certainly, most certainly. Thank you. So within the domain of astrophysics, there are plenty of examples and ways in which compelling evidence and evidence in general has been used as an instrument of power. So I must begin by, of course, emphasizing that there is a competitiveness within the landscape of academia in general, and this is different within physics and astrophysics in particular, and that competitiveness is generally associated with a push to publish the most compelling and noteworthy scientific results that are obtainable. So for those who possess character traits that you can say are ripe for taking compelling evidence and using it as an instrument of power, perhaps those who are egotistical, who wish to position themselves very high up within the hierarchy of academia. Scientific results obtained both from the observational side and also from the theoretical side, which are considered noteworthy and rather, I could say, groundbreaking within the community, can be used by scientists, by individual scientists or groups of scientists to elevate their status within the field. And they can do so, of course, by publishing widely, being highly cited within the journals, being able to use that compelling evidence to apply for funding, prestigious grants, and win accolades as a result of their noteworthy findings. Essentially, they're able to use so-called compelling or noteworthy evidence to elevate their position and obtain a level of prestige. And for those that are capable of doing harm, this level of prestige, this cloak of, you can say, importance, or some might even say fame, can be used as a way of wielding power over others. And the others, in this case, generally tend to be those that exist lower down within the academic hierarchy. So individuals who are particularly vulnerable are students, masters and PhD students, the postdoctoral researchers, essentially early career scientists who have not yet been able to obtain the level of experience that would put them in a position to garner the prestige that comes about from publishing compelling and noteworthy results. So actual examples of this wielding of power by so-called prestigious scientists has come about through the silencing of abuse victims within the field, those who have been harmed through verbal and sexual assault, and those who have been harmed also financially through the employment structure. They've experienced a lack of access to funding, jobs, etc., for a complex variation of reasons. Also, a tendency to scoop or steal noteworthy research results from those who do not possess a high enough position within the academic hierarchy. This is common as well. Students, and the most famous example of this is Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who discovered pulsars through an instrument and experimental setup that she herself built, was scooped by her PhD supervisors, who went on to win the Nobel Prize for the discovery of these objects, these astrophysical objects that exist in space. So that's a famous example of ways in which one can use their level within the academic hierarchy, which they're able to achieve by publishing compelling evidence. And they can essentially use that to silence and steal scientific results and essentially push themselves higher up within the academic structure. So it's a kind of vicious cycle that perpetuates. So this is a way in which, and these are the ways in which evidence is used as an instrument of power within the framework of astrophysics, essentially.
Thank you so much, Sthabile, for taking us inside the discipline and giving us some insights into the politics that happens within the research space. And I think it'd be really interesting to put that into dialogue with the bigger questions about justice that Melanie raised in the previous round. So now, Pawas, it's over to you to weigh in on this topic.
Thank you. So I'll continue speaking to the field of environmental communication in the domain of mainstream media, and I'll continue to speak to the particular case which I introduced around air pollution. So I've spoken about how there's a intense datafication of the media storytelling and how this has become the key set of evidence that drives the storytelling. And it is very, very clear in our analysis that this is being deployed as an instrument of inclusion and exclusion. So what we see here is that these categories, these numerical categories, as I mentioned earlier, decontextualize the environmental harm. There is no space left in the storytelling for actual experiences, the embodied experiences of harm. I mean, Leslie mentioned this in relation to disability, but what we see in the actual experience of environmental harm from an issue such as air pollution is that there are vast inequalities in the capacities of populations to mitigate that harm. There is a small section of the population which is able to remove themselves into sort of private atmospheres of sanitized air, using air purifiers or limiting their exposure to polluted air. But the vast majority of the urban workforce, the poorer communities, are at the forefront of this exposure and harm. But in a media storytelling that is driven largely by numerical abstract categorizations of harm or contamination, there is no space for these experiences. What is also very interesting is that the manner in which this data is also framed is one that is often in line with the interests of government and policy stakeholders. So I just want to draw attention to the manner in which this data is being categorized. So what we see in the storytelling and the data presentation around this issue is that pollution is often categorized as in-city population, in-city pollution, and out-city pollution, pollution that's coming from outside sources. Now, scientifically, this kind of categorization has no basis because air is flowing through a large geographical region, and actually there's an airshed approach that scientifically is being proposed that if we have to tackle air pollution, we have to think in terms of large air masses and actually look at the subcontinent as a whole. You can't be really considering the city. But when we look at the media storytelling, we see the salience of these categories saying, look, this is us, the citizen subjects of the city who matter, and this is what we contribute. And here are the rural others, often sometimes even others in other national borders. So, the bad air from Pakistan that might be coming through onto our country. So we see this narrativization of excluding others. Who matters is the people who are kept in and people who don't matter as citizen subjects. There's a very particular category here of agricultural workers, farmers who are residing in the neighboring Indian states of Punjab, Haryana. These farmers are being forced to burn some of their agricultural residue because of there is a complex set of reasons, but essentially because there are agricultural policies that are failing. This agricultural residue burning contributes a small percentage of pollution in the winter months, but there's an inordinate focus on this pollution in the media storytelling because it is very it fits. It's salient for both the political actors and the media actors to say, look, this is not our problem. This is being generated by these rural others. What we also see linked to this is also a kind of politics of visibility, which is around technological intervention. So we see state actors often intervening with technological solutions such as smoke towers and water cannons. Now these again scientifically have very little credibility in terms of actually being able to mitigate harm or to solve the problem. But what they function very effectively as a symbol of a certain kind of technological modernity, and are therefore also incredibly salient for media actors to pick this up. So we see a confluence of kind of interest between media storytellers and sort of state policy actors. I'll hopefully pick up some of these themes later, but I'll end there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pawas. So interesting to get some insight into how particular bits of evidence get kind of blown out of proportion by powerful actors in some circumstances. Okay, so now let's move the conversation on into the realm of disability studies. So over to you, Leslie, if you are ready.
Thank you, Mehita, and thank you to all the other speakers. If you are unfortunate enough to get involved in an accident, insurance companies will have to make some sort of assessment, if you have insurance, of how much you're going to be paid out. And one of the technologies that's used by insurance companies is actually a map of the body. So if, for example, you lose one finger, it's X amount. If you lose two fingers, it's 2X amount. So part of what we talk about in disability is in terms of the use of power, is these technologies of counting, which look very objective and in some ways are, but which have very profound implications for people. So part of how the history of how disability has been thought about is absolutely linked to these technologies of counting and ideas about science. So we know that historically, ideas about what the ideal body should look like, what a diseased body is, what an unacceptable body is, have had profound implications for people's lives. People tend to forget that under Nazism, the people who were killed before the Jews and other groups were in the T4 group. These were people who were seen as having bodies that were not useful to the economy. The term that was used in Nazi ideology was useless feeders, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. So that there is a link between a particular kind of body and whether it is useful to society in general. And that links to various other kinds of histories of counting in disability, which have been very influential. For example, the concept that comes from psychology, my own discipline, of mental age, which some people still use, which is supposedly your intelligence, your IQ is the ratio between your mental age and your chronological age, which is why the average IQ is 100, because it's 1/100%. Really serves in a whole range of ways to determine where you're allowed to be in space, whether you should be institutionalized, and so on. So it links to this counting, which looks very objective and scientific, and is in many ways, links to a whole range of ideas about evolution, social Darwinism, the relationship between people and animals, who deserves to be called a human. So all of these technologies are absolutely central in the way that power has been operated. Within the context of colonialism, one theorist has noted it's not only the fact that colonialism in an objective sense is disabling, that extractive economies, and we've actually heard from various other speakers about this in a range of ways. Extractive economies are actually productive of disability. So if you think in South Africa of agriculture, mining, you are creating impairment through a particular way of interacting with nature. But it's not just that. There's also an ideological way in which disability operates through these practices. So, for example, if you think about the gaze of the Western onto the so-called non-Western people, by definition, because of their different bodies, and you can measure it, can be seen as disabled by their lack of conformity to a particular kind of ideal. But on the other hand, if they conform to the dominant ideal, then they become alienated from their culture. So they then become disabled in another way. It's a kind of a hall of mirrors. So there is this politics of counting as a way of excluding not only disability, but disability is implicated in a whole range of exclusions, including racial and colonial exclusion. Thanks, Mehita. I think I've got on too much. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you, Leslie. You're perfectly on time. Again, some very important insights there on the different ways in which evidence is used and abused by power. So I think this is the perfect moment to switch that discussion, and we'll move into our third round, which Anna is going to chair, looking at the opposite. How can different forms of evidence be used in strategies of resistance? So over to you, Anna.
Great, thank you. So for round three, we're gonna hopefully bring our spirit of resistance out from the heap of troubles we have with authority and power that we've heard layered from so many different perspectives. So for this round, we've asked, in your experience, how has or can that particular form of evidence be used as an instrument of empowerment or resistance? So we'll start again with Melanie.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I had to scratch my head on this one, but I found a really good example. And this is an arrest warrant that was issued by the International Criminal Court on 15th August 2017. And this was based largely on evidence collected from social media. So I hope that I'll be in the good books of Anna, because this is the sort of data that interests her. So by way of a bit more background, the arrest warrant was issued against Mohammed Mustafa Bouzaif al-Wefali in the context of the Libyan situation. And there were allegedly 33 ordered murders in the Benghazi region. Proceedings have since been terminated, and because Mr. Wefali has died, also do social media reports say. So this is important. This is really significant, because the arrest warrant initially was based on 7 separate incidents that were captured in 7 separate videos that appeared on social media. And, you know, courts are notoriously known for being dinosaurs, and here we have an instance where they were actually willing to take this information on board and go ahead with it. So the wealth of information collated, documented, and archived from digital evidence and from on-the-ground evidence has since been repeated in numerous and countless incidences. Ukraine is just one of them, where we have at the moment the reconstructions of events and patterns, child abduction being one of them, and documentations of crimes by a number of NGOs and also general public, members of the public, who can upload information onto various applications to make sure that evidence is somewhat captured. Now, of course, there's a flip side to that. There's the propensity for that sort of evidence to also be used as propaganda or misinterpreted. So that, of course, is something that we all need to grapple with. Verification of bottom-up evidence and how to make sense of it. And this is something that we're also experiencing with students, of course, when they embark on projects that we run here at Bournemouth University, where we're mapping mass graves that are found in Ukraine. And so there we started operating with a little traffic light system, where we tried to sort of discern, okay, what is the quantitative, how many sources are there? So is there a quantitative credibility? So has it repeatedly been said? And a qualitative assessment to sort of say, okay, this is authoritative, this comes from a reliable source, this is an independent NGO, and okay, this is just a witness statement. And I think increasingly this quest for evidence and the distinction of what is fact and what is fiction, it dominates our efforts as educators as well. And what does good fact finding and providing of facts look like? How can it be done without it overwhelming us? And what is good enough in what circumstance to make an assessment? But I wanted to pick up on something that Sthabile said earlier on. And I think what's really important is perhaps not the question, what's bottom up, what's bottom down, but how can the two meet? And there actually in the social sciences, we're in a quite privileged position because we can do research collaboratively. And by collaborative, I mean a little bit like here. So the rules of engagement start to matter. Who's invited to the table? Who's allowed to speak? Who am I privileging at any given point in time when I'm trying to sort of get to the substance of a subject matter? And I think those are really sort of careful considerations that we as scientists or we as legal scholars can shape. And so the rules of engagement really matter in the way that we privilege or silence or allow people to partake in a discussion for the furtherance of the knowledge and sort of make that collaborative. And I think that might be neither top nor bottom up. So that's what I wanted to say on that subject. Am I good with my 5 minutes?
Yes. It's lots to think about. And now every time you talk, I want to do this event together next semester more. So this is good. Okay, so let's move on to our next speaker. Pawas, do you want to come in?
I thought usually we're going with Sthabile first. I'm happy to.
I'm sorry. No, my fault. Sthabile, sorry, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I was happy to take on whichever chronological order was right in this moment. Okay, so now coming to the question of how we can use evidence to empower, specifically in our field in astrophysics and in physics, those who are less capable of speaking for themselves or being taken seriously or being heard within our field simply because they do not sit within the right position. They're not positioned high enough within the hierarchy to be to have their words considered as a representation, or rather a valid truth of the inequality, the lack of equity that exists within our field, and also how a very steep hierarchy prevents those who are lower down from being able to essentially work in an environment that is safe, that affords them the safety of knowing that they will not have to encounter various forms of abuse. So one aspect that some physicists have begun to borrow as far as compiling evidence to counter malpractice within academia, specifically within astrophysics, is using social sciences, going to the humanities department and seeing the ways in which social scientists are able to build up on research that allows us to effectively understand many of the systemic and structural inequalities that exist and that kind of propel and are the foundation for much of the harmful behavior that we observe within our field. For instance, the ways in which social scientists are able to use interviews and responses from groups of scientists in order to capture or get a sense of the experiences, the actual day-to-day lives of scientists and what they have to encounter within their field, and how that is very dependent on their identity, what Leslie has spoken about, the whether they are disabled or not, or whether they are considered disabled within the framework of their field on the basis of how well they are able to integrate and measure up to what is considered the norm in their field. So within astrophysics, we know that this is a field that has been historically white male dominant, and in particular, the white males that have been able to achieve the level of status in our fields are those who come from particularly privileged backgrounds. So it is not just cisgender white male, but is also a level of privilege, financial, you can say privilege, that is required to be successful within academia because of how the system is structured. Because up until the time that a person is able to achieve a permanent position, they need to go through a series of short-term contracts, postdoctoral positions. And this is generally a very turbulent time within a person's life, in that they have to, over the course of 2 or 3 years, flesh out research, compelling evidence, and have that published, peer-reviewed, and then published, and be able to then use that as motivation to find their next postdoctoral contract. And all of this may continue almost indefinitely until one finds a permanent position, which are few and far between within our field. So there is a sense of instability that one experiences in their early career lives as an astrophysicist. So that was taking me to the point of how difficult it is to achieve status within the field, and how one needs to be positioned and have you can say the right class privilege, the right cultural privilege in order to achieve status that puts them in a position of power. So going back to the social sciences, we can use the experiences of those who are in this, you can say, still in the unstable phase of their careers, the early career scientists, speak to them and find out about the challenges that they're facing in order to help us tackle the issues, the systemic issues that inhibit young researchers, young scientists from achieving a level of status, specifically those young scientists who do not represent the norm in as far as their identities go within the field. So the humanities, I find, are generally, I would say maybe this might be a stretch and a generalization, but are not considered a trustworthy source for knowledge within physics, within astrophysics. There is a kind of sense of prestige that some astrophysics, perhaps the previous generation of astrophysics, seem to ascribe to their field as it being a study or a practice, an academic practice that seems to exist at a higher position above other forms of knowledge gaining or knowledge seeking. So this is one of the challenges that I have identified as a young Black woman working within astrophysics, the sense that we cannot trust the methods that social scientists have created for helping us understand systemic issues that result in discrimination and inhibiting of, or rather I should say, lack of equity, and also structural obstacles that prevent us from creating a more diverse field within astrophysics, essentially. So we would need to develop a sense of trust in social sciences and humanities as a way of then giving us the knowledge that we need to tackle our issues within our field, essentially. I hope I've flesh that out well enough so that you understand where I'm coming from. So that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I think there's something really interesting there we perhaps we can come back to at the very end around kind of what solidarity might look like between disciplines on these issues, as well as, that trap that gets created by the kind of epistemologies that could liberate then being discredited from the outsource, so that there's kind of no way to make those critiques. I think there's something really important in both of those observations that tie a lot of what we've been talking about together. So I am conscious of that we've got about 20 minutes left. So we'll go to Pawas and just ask for a few minutes from you, and then a few minutes from.
Sure. So very quickly, again, sort of, picking up on the problems of media storytelling around environmental harm, and I've laid out the problem as storytelling that is decontextualized, storytelling that has is not leaving any room for ascribing differentiated a sense of responsibility and vulnerabilities. So this is the kind of problematic terrain that we are functioning on, and essentially in terms of examples of empowerment coming from the bottom up, it fundamentally boils down to developing an ethics of storytelling and demanding a different kind of storytelling, which foregrounds marginalized and silenced perspectives, which speaks to a differentiated sense of harm and clearly attributes responsibility for the mitigation of harm, but also a story that is foregrounding lived experience of other ways of being that are more that are already providing pathways for solution or living in a different way. And these are often coming from actors who might not be seen as having the knowledge for these kinds of solutions. These might be sort of lived experiences of communities that are seen as lacking that kind of knowledge. So within our project, we have tried to kind of create the space for this kind of empowerment. So this project was not just a project of analysis of existing storytelling, but we also worked on empowering new environmental storytellers and expanding the spaces for this kind of storytelling. So we have undertaken the training of new environmental storytellers, but we also, as part of the project, developed 3 film narratives that sought to exemplify some of these principles. So these 3 films are available on our project website. So it's pollutionstories.org, and you can access the films there. Fundamentally, there are 3 films that we've made. One is called Delhi 2.5. This is a film that's looking at the experiences of the younger generation of residents of the city of Delhi. But the way the film is narrativized, it focuses on 2 young people in the city, but one coming from the more affluent middle class background, and one coming from a more a poorer and out of city, a more suburban industrial area. And we have then in the narrative been actually able to also demonstrate that while there are shared experiences of harm that these 2 young people suffer, but we contextualize and show the vast differences in the ability of these young people and their families indeed to mitigate this harm. And so I think this is important, and we've demonstrated this, this idea of differentiation in storytelling and differentiation of harm and responsibility. There's a film which is around the issue of agricultural crop burning. I mentioned this, and how this was being disproportionately focused in the kind of media storytelling. And here in this film, we tell the story from the perspective of the farmers. So we've deliberately shifted the perspective, away from the sort of middle class urban perspective to that of the farmers. And what we are then able to actually uncover is a far more complex narrative of a food system, that is completely on the point of breakdown. And we are able to draw crucial linkages between issues such as climate change, food production, and air pollution. And what we actually require for the mitigation and the solution of these problems is that kind of systemic complex thinking, and that kind of shifting of perspective actually allows us to do that kind of more complex storytelling. And again, what we do also in in telling the story from the perspective of the farmers is to actually highlight the farmers' own awareness of these issues and indeed their ways of working with nature, which is completely left out from the more dominant media storytelling. The final film actually is a film that focuses on kind of mobility justice within the city. So I've spoken about this idea of the politics of visibility, how there's a certain imagination of a particular kind of urban space that is desirable. But very often this desirable urban space is defined by a very narrow middle class kind of outlook of a certain kind of green aesthetics. What we do in this film is that we disrupted by bringing in the perspective of a Muslim housewife, again, from a working class background, and a carpenter who uses a bicycle to go to work in the city of Delhi. And we show in the film the city through their eyes and the difficulty that they have in navigating the city in a non-motorized way. And in doing so, I think we are able to kind of, dislodge some of that very embedded green aesthetics, a kind of the kind of middle class politics of visibility that is in play around the air pollution narrative, and largely and more broadly the imagination of what a sustainable city kind of looks like. So, I mean, very broadly, I think to summarize, I think data is a very crucial part of environmental storytelling in the media. What we are saying is that data needs to go hand in hand with an ethics of storytelling, which brings in the experiences and perspectives of marginalized populations who are often the majority and who are often the more vulnerable communities, and this is crucial, and we are demanding this of the new generation of storytellers. But of course, some of these problems are systemic. We need to create more space for such narratives. There needs to be greater infrastructural support for this kind of storytelling, and there also needs to be sort of greater training and capacity building. That needs to happen. So I'll leave it there.
Great. So we'll go to Leslie for a final word on our round three. We've got a great question in the chat too. So if anyone else wants to squeeze in a question in the time we'll have at the end, please type it in the chat.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, clearly we need much longer for all of these discussions. I'm going to try and be as brief as I can so that we do have some time for discussion. I think one of the most important contributions of contemporary ideas about disability, and this links to what other people have been saying, is that disability is a relational construct. So it's not something that you have inside you, but it's about your relationship with, for example, an urban environment, as Pawas has just been speaking about. So the classic example is that if I'm a wheelchair and I look for a job in a building where there are only staircases and no ramps and lifts, where is the disability? It's somewhere in the relationship between me and the environment. And I'm very pleased that you spoke about mobilities, because it's a key part actually of how we are rethinking disability. So who can go where and on what basis? And it's not a question of impairment and the body often. Second contribution of disability theory that I think is very important is understanding the distinction between disability as an identity and disability affecting what you can and can't do. I mean, tied up with the idea of identity is often stigma and so on. So if you look at the history of censuses, which is a very interesting history, censuses used to ask questions like, and apologies, but this is absolutely accurate: are you deaf, blind, or crippled? And that would be how the census would ask questions about disability. And we thought that there were quite low rates of disability, actually. A group called the Washington Group, which has been very influential, has refashioned how we ask questions about disability to ask questions about, do you have difficulty doing this? Do you have a lot, a little, and so on, and in various domains. So in globally, the rates of disability have gone up, not because people have changed, but we're asking questions in different ways. So that's really important in terms of including people and providing the kinds of resources that people need to be able to participate on an equal basis of others in society. And that fits with a strategy which I know others will be aware of, but I just want to mention that disability is really brought to the rest of how we think about the environment, both physical and online, which is the concept of universal design. And that is, if we change the environment in such a way that it is good for people with impairments, it's usually good for other people as well. So, for example, if you have lifts or ramps, you're designing a city with curb cuts and so on, it's really good for people who use wheelchairs, but it's also good for people with young children, etc., and so on and so forth. And I think there's universal design shows us how environments themselves become disabling. And just as a last sort of anecdote, the building that I work in before I worked here was not accessible. We did not have lifts or ramps or whatever we do now. But a young Black man joined this academic department many, many years ago and would go up and down the stairs carrying heavy boxes of paper until eventually he became disabled. So that there's something happening about the environment which itself was disabling. And I think that that's a really important contribution of disability studies. I've got lots of other things to say, but I know we need to have some discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you to our 4 speakers for all of these insights. We have just under 10 minutes left. I know this is an intense roundtable where we try to squeeze in so many different perspectives. We have 2 useful comments in the chat, which I'll try to summarize and share, in addition to just a couple of other comments. And then I'm going to hand back to the speakers for a last kind of minute each to leave us with a pithy insight if they so wish. So we've explored so many different perspectives on what evidence is, from the macro to the micro. But I think the thing that's really emerged in this conversation is how evidence is contested, multifaceted, layered, and indeed variable. So that requires us to continue, I think, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary conversations about what the data is that we're gathering and the status that it has, not only in our disciplines, but also in other disciplines. And that, I think, brings us to the question of status and justice, which seems to be a central theme in what all 4 of our speakers said in relation to how evidence gets deployed both to do good and to do harm. And I think there's a lot more that we need to be exploring in terms of questions of hierarchy and justice, and what kinds of forms of silencing are happening with evidentiary basis and not. And that to me seems a key theme that's come through in all the comments that colleagues have made. And then in terms of the extent to which our research practices and the evidence and the data that we're gathering can kind of feed into emancipatory projects, the common thread that I've picked up from the comments so far is not only about questions about listening, so who is being heard and how, who is being seen and how, right? Those are very important questions that have come up, I think, across all of the comments, but also the idea of focus, like what is put into focus and what is put out of focus. So questions of visibility and listening seem to be key in terms of thinking about how evidence can be deployed in emancipatory and progressive ways. These are just a couple of comments that come to my mind on having listened to all the contributions so far. We have 2 comments also from the room. One is asking about, I guess, transdisciplinarity and how we need to develop more spaces to listen to one another across disciplines. So if any of the 4 speakers has a comment to make about what trans or multidisciplinary listening might look like from their perspectives, like what do they want from their discipline to be heard by those in others, and what in turn do they realize they need to listen to more from other disciplinary perspectives. And then we have another great question from Tracy. Sorry, that last comment was from Amber Murray in Dewa, who might already have left the room. If not, thank you for that. And then we have a comment from Tracy Bailey, who is asking about what democratization of knowledge might look like from each of the panelists' perspectives, which I think is a really great question. And then Anum Eklar is asking about how as researchers, I think this question, you can all see it in the chat, is about an ethical orientation. So how do researchers ethically orient themselves in terms of building evidence bases and data sources I think this is a bigger question about how do we as researchers navigate the power structures that sometimes constrain or enable the work that we do. So with the last few minutes that we have, I invite the speakers to each give us their last snippet of insight or commentary. I know these are big questions and there's never enough time to explore these, but at least we're making a start in roundtables like this. So over to you, Melanie, Sthabile, Pawas, and Leslie, to give us your final thoughts.
Okay, I suppose I'll stick with the order. So I think there was a question in democratization. I can't say it, democratization. And I think because there's a crisis of democratization, I'm not actually sure I have a lot to say on that. So I'll cop out of that and say it's probably more about participation. And I think Sthabile has given us participation within the academy. So who enters the academy and how does it work within the academy? And then a lot of the other comments was, okay, how do we bring the outside into our discussions in terms of knowledge creation? What participation needs to happen to feed in to our knowledge production, our processes of knowledge creation, and then also how that feeds out. That's how I sort of maybe try and categorize this. And there, I think it's about more participation, but probably it's got something to do again with how do we operate these processes in a meaningful way, in a way that sort of works for the subject matter. And I think that's a methodological and an ethical and almost a moral discussion as well. We have a word for this in law, procedural justice. So, it's about how we procedurally advance justice rather than keep the eye just on substantive justice as an outcome. And it's something that we're always grappling with. There was a question on centralization of data. And that's a really good one, because I think, like everybody, I'm guilty of just not having enough capacity to listen. So I'm limited by my own cognitive capacity. So the way I try and get around that is to have a brilliant team around me, but that means I need the money to pay for that team. So we're back to the discussion about, well, how do you get a permanent post? How do you bring talented people in? How do you have a diverse team so that you actually are exposed to all these things that I ought to listen to? So those are the little things that I try and do in my work, but it's not a great recipe. I don't have a good answer for all these questions. I struggle with them on a day-to-day basis as I try and do research.
Okay. All right. I'm ready to go. Thank you very much to
Please go ahead.
Anna, Mehita, and the other speakers, Leslie, Pawas, and Melanie, for these amazing insights that have also helped me understand more of how evidence and power operate within astrophysics. So what I've taken from this, as far as going forward and imagining a more democratized structure within a hierarchy of physics and astrophysics, it almost seems fantastical in my mind after my few years of experience within the field, that any such structure could be possible, but it helps to begin to imagine what that would look like. And I think about, to begin with, those who enter astrophysics and are positioned immediately as the so-called ontological others. So those who are neurodiverse, or who have the so-called hidden disabilities and the neurodivergence, those who have a more outward, you can say, disabilities, in that they are from a cultural background that is not commonly represented within astrophysics, etc. Those who are first-generation graduates, those from low-income backgrounds, etc. The ontological others, if there's a way in which these individuals can find support from the structure, in that they are provided an environment where they are listened to, where they are heard, where their concerns as far as discrimination or a lack of access to the funding that they need to thrive within the field, etc. All of these challenges that ontological others are facing within the field can be taken seriously by those who already exist within power structures in the field. I find that we could move towards a more democratized academic hierarchy. But as long as those who are in power seek only to hold on to their power and use it to wield, could say, authority over the scientists who are developing their careers, then of course the structure will not change. It will continue to remain in place, and we will continue to perceive academia as a broken system, as many scientists already describe it, especially within astrophysics. So those are my final thoughts. Democratization requires a complete restructuring of the entire academic system, and all hands on deck are required for such a procedure. Thank you.
Thank you, Sthabile. And likewise, I would like to thank all the panelists, and this has been really fascinating, very thought-provoking. I mean, I just very quickly would say, absolutely transdisciplinarity, has to be the key to, I think, overcoming some of these problems of, hierarchies of knowledge and the siloed thinking that we see often stymieing really any sort of real solutions to many of the problems that we've been sort of highlighting. So in my own field of environmental communication, I feel absolutely that developing ways of working together whereby we can disrupt these hierarchies of knowledge and create this idea of multiple layeness, and storytelling. I'm a storyteller. I often feel that storytelling methods based in listening and telling stories and developing stories together could be one pathway actually for creating that kind of a more equal space of understandings and shared ways of working together. Again, as Sthabile said, I mean, a lot of this is linked to structural, problems. Where are those spaces? Where can we create those spaces? Where is the funding and the money and the policy support for creating those spaces? But but we should have a sense of where we need to be headed, and I think that is very much the direction we need to go towards. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Well. Yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful. And the transdisciplinarity issue, I mean, I just think, wow, I mean, we're kind of embodying it. It feels like I've learned so much from other people. I'm just going to say sort of one thing from the field of disability studies, that a key question always for disability studies is the question of accessibility and who has access to what and on what basis. And there are two parts to that, and we've all spoken about it in different ways. There are technical questions, what a building must look like, what kind of sign capturing, but there are also attitudinal questions. And I think what disability studies brings to transdisciplinarity is a much more general question, which others have spoken about, is who's allowed to be here in this conversation, who is thought to have knowledge and so on. And part of that has to do with things that we never think about. The next meeting that I'm going to today is in Stellenbosch University Museum, which won a prize for being the most accessible, wonderful museum in Africa. There wasn't a toilet that people who are wheelchair users could use. And it takes, kind of active. There isn't. We do now have it. I mean, I refuse to go until we got. But if you, the thing about disability studies is that if you get disability right, it helps you to think about a whole lot of other ways of exclusion. So I would argue that we should always start there. But clearly that's my bias. But thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everyone who attended. What a fantastic conversation it's been. I think I'm only going to fully be able to process all of this when I look through the transcript and develop it from there. But please join me in thanking all of our speakers for sharing their time, sharing their insights, sharing their being so hospitable in their speaking of hospitality and accessibility and sharing their insights. Anna, is there anything you'd like to say as well as we bid everybody goodbye, those who are, I'm sure, logging off because they have to rush to other things, but we'll stick around for a little while if anyone in the room also wants to linger. We'll be here.
Great. Yes. Thank you, everyone. I was just going to say, as the slide says, do follow our accounts to find out about the next E&P. We've already got a couple of our speakers in mind. Do also feel free to send us an email if you think of someone who you think would make an excellent contributor to these transdisciplinary discussions. And thank you, everyone. I learned so much. It's just such, you realize how rare real transdisciplinary conversations are when you actually have one in a setting like this and you see what comes from it. So very grateful to all of you who came to speak and came to listen today.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. There's some great comments coming through in the chat saying the same. So yeah, well done to us, and ciao to everybody who's in the process of leaving.
And thank you again, Melanie, for everything behind the scenes.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Sthabile. Thank you, Pawas. Thank you, Melanie. What a cool discussion. I'm still processing it all. We're still working on our, well, when I say we, it's mostly me that is holding things up, but on the transcript from our first Evidence and Power. And it was such a rich discussion. There's so much in there that I think there's a real potential for a nice series of collaboratively written transdisciplinary essays.
I mean, just from if I could just say, as one of the people who was lucky enough to be a speaker, it's just so rare to learn so much in such a short space of time. So the format you've put together is quite amazing, actually. And I'm just going to have to process a whole lot of stuff. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
I've learned a lot from Anna over the years that we've known each other, and one of them is how to run a really great workshop of any kind. She's a very brilliant person in many fields, but you have a particular talent for this kind of thing, Anna.
I think it's been a good brainchild of your idea to dig deep into the epistemology, and then
it's kind of fun because we don't often get a chance to.
You almost need a translation, don't you? Because we all use different words to say very similar things, whether it's participation, democratization, accessibility, inclusivity. You almost need a sort of matrix whereby you sort of unpick what might mean something very, very similar. That we all use different words for it. And is that deliberate, or how does that happen? I just think that's quite fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other genius ideas Anna had about this project, and I think it will just come in time, was the one thing we're thinking about is to try to turn the roundtables into some kind of written record. But the other idea Anna had was, well, isn't there some other way to translate what we learn into some kind of zine or some kind of, and maybe once we've gathered enough of these transcripts and we find a bit of time that we can produce something like that, where we could do that exact kind of work, where we put these different concepts into dialogue with one another in a kind of more visual format. Could be really fun. I'm dreaming big here in terms of time and resources, but I think we might get there someday.
Yeah, I think so. I think we've got 5 E&Ps or 6 E&Ps. There's a fun bit in that.
Stay tuned for the Evidence and Power zine comic series, where all of you will be recast as some kind of superhero.
Oh, that would be really fun if we have the avatars of the people talking and stuff. That could work really well.
Can we choose a superpower?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I need the best costume though. You've got to decide.
You get to choose your own costumes. How about that?
Oh yeah, and can I have an avatar? I'd always like you as Anna, or whatever the little comic-y.
Yeah, I know we've lost that. So that was Alex Alberta. She was our grad student, and we got to hire her as an RA to do art. So it was a wonderful 4 years that have now come to pass because she has a full-time job. But I think it is a really nice form for using expertise. So I think it's one to keep in mind. And also we're open to suggestions. So if anyone thinks of forms or sees any kinds of calls come through that we might collaborate on.
Yeah. But just thank you once again, because it's also sometimes you're in the midst of doing things, and you almost need a prompt like this to kind of scale up and look at the kind of some of the kind of transdisciplinary linkages, but also sort of slightly more conceptual thinking around just your practice or what you're observing. So this was very timely, and thank you so much. And as Leslie said, just hearing the echoes of or the resonance of what some of the ideas that you're thinking in the thinking of so many others is sort of very affirmative and is energizing.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just add to that, and this is partly also in my experiences editing the South African Journal of Science, which is a transdisciplinary journal. One of the things that we don't talk about, but I mean, maybe you could do something around this, is what prejudices people from certain scientific disciplines have about other scientific disciplines. Because it's I mean, the strength of, I could show you, I could go on and on because I've been sort of shocked by some of it, but it's also misinformation because of the way, and this goes back to what a lot of things that Sthabile was talking about, the way that the academy is organized, is we are organized to be strangers to one another, and we are encouraged, we are incentivized to diss other disciplines and so on. And I think we can all say, we all love one another, but also we've got to think about the ways in which we have to resist our own socialization and our reproduction of interdisciplinary competition, prejudice, and so on. I think that could be a lot of fun, actually. Yeah. And useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a very important point. Yeah.
Very. Lovely. Okay, colleagues. Well, I feel sad to say goodbye to all of you, but I suppose it has to happen. We can't stay on the screen together all day.
At every disciplinary disability studies meeting I have ever attended in the community, we will now close the meeting with prayer.
Okay.
So, it's always fascinating to me as a Jewish atheist, to be, I'm constantly being asked, will I give the Christian prayer at the end?
My yoga teacher does what does she say? It's lovely. She says, we will now put our hands to our heart and thank each other for being in this space together. So
that's lovely.
Thank you.
That's nice.
Absolutely.
I like that.
That's something we can do.
Okay.
Bye.
Right. Lovely. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.